Hi, everybody. I'm Linda Solomon Wood, and this is Conversations. Tonight, I'm going to be interviewing Elizabeth May. I'm really excited about that. But before we start the interview with Elizabeth, I'm really pleased to introduce our special musical guest, Yolanda Bruno. Yolanda is a violinist with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Yolanda, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, Linda. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to open your Earth Day conversation. I look forward to sharing a short piece of music for you written by Johann Sebastian Bach. And I will play that music on a very special violin. This instrument was made 300 years ago in 1737 in
Wow.
Venice in Italy. It's on loan to me. It's such an honor playing on this old violin. And when I hold such an old instrument built to last, I can't help but think of where it might be in 300 years from now. I hope you enjoy the music.
Mm. Wow.
Thank you so much.
Yolanda, that was so beautiful. What a beautiful ode to the earth. And I'm so happy that you will be back with us later in the hour to play again. And is there anything you wanted to just briefly say?
The only thing I would say is that that beautiful rhythm that you heard, it's like a heartbeat. This rhythm here. And because the instrument is actually pressed up against my neck, I can feel my own heart beating against the instrument. And for me, on Earth Day, I feel it's a demonstration of just how interconnected we are to things we can't even understand and imagine. So thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. To our audience, I just want to remind you that the chat is open and our team's going to be moderating and sharing links to relevant stories as I interview our very wonderful guests tonight. And Yolanda will be back for another performance at the end of the hour. And we also have another special feature tonight. You will be seeing a really great group of subscribers who answered our call and sent in video questions ahead of time for Elizabeth May. Well, Elizabeth hardly needs an introduction, but for those of you who may be new to Canadian politics, and I know we have some young people on the call today, Elizabeth May is a member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, and for 12 years, she led Canada's federal Green Party from 2006 to 2019. She's an author and a lawyer and no stranger to climate negotiations. As that brilliant author and columnist Michael Harris wrote me today, for a guest on Earth Day, you really couldn't do any better than Elizabeth May. So, Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Linda. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight. Wow, what a big day. So let's dive right in. So the United States is back in the global fight against climate change. The European Union is hammering out the specifics of its European Green Deal. How would you say Canada is doing?
We're the embarrassment in the room. We're so far out of the league of what the US has announced, what the European Union has already done. Our current record is the worst in the G7. Even after 4 years of Trump, our record is significantly worse. So we really need to face facts. I mean, it's the time for tough love. You know, it's not partisan. I sure would love to celebrate what the Liberals were doing, but they have not yet got a target that's consistent with holding to 1.5 degrees. And they have this persistent problem. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, I shouldn't diagnose, but cognitive dissonance is a problem where you can say, we are climate leaders and the pipeline must be built. I mean, they bought a pipeline. They're going to spend $17 billion of public money. I mean, it's frustrating because I think the intentions were good, and I'm willing to bend over backwards to say, well, there are these structural problems, and Environment Canada was pretty clearly Harperized and hasn't really got scientists in it the way it used to. But that's just making excuses. We need a really strong public movement that shifts us to say what needs to be said and adopt the target we need to adopt, and change the useless so-called Climate Accountability Act as quickly as possible before it passes, so that by the time we get to COP26 in Glasgow at the end of this year, we actually are in the same league as European Union countries. And I mean, that's a big stretch. I mean, Boris Johnson and the UK are gearing up for 78% below 1990 levels. We're 21% above 1990 levels, which is why we used 2005 levels, because our pollution was a lot more in 2005. So cutting from there is easier than going back to when we had 1990 levels, which all the other industrialized countries except the US use, is trying to stick to 1990. And I don't want to talk numbers all the time because people's eyes will glaze over. But no, I'm embarrassed for us as a country that our first call to US President Joe Biden was to say, why did you cancel that pipeline?
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, what did you think of Trudeau's announcement today at Biden's climate summit?
Well, I don't think they were going to let him speak unless that we had a much tougher under the Paris Agreement. These targets are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Unlike, I mean, for those of you who really followed this, and I did scroll through the list, so hello, David Hallman, who I know really knows this stuff, and Ralph Torrey, you really know this stuff. But going way, back in Kyoto, the targets countries adopted were baked into the text of the treaty. The Paris Agreement innovation was to say, okay, we're not going to bake the targets into the treaty. We'll file those separately with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, and we can improve them anytime. We can change our target anytime, but only to ratchet up. Now, Canada has had the same target that we had put in place by Stephen Harper, unchanged since May 2015. We were supposed to ratchet up under the terms of what we agreed to in Paris. We were supposed to change our target to a tougher one last year in 2020. We skipped it. We didn't think it mattered. We didn't think anyone would notice. What we announced today was the bare minimum. I think it was probably the bare minimum to allow Justin Trudeau to be in the room, the virtual room.
Well, we're seeing more targets for emissions and action being set for 2030 rather than just 2050. What do you make of this shift to tighter timelines?
Well, it's essential. I mean, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change delivered for the world the ultimate wake-up call, which was the October 2018 report in which the best science peer review system in the history of the world, and not just specifically the climate, but of any topic. This is the best, toughest, most rigorous peer review process. That's what makes it slow and late. But the IPCC report, which was commissioned by the governments that assembled in Paris to answer the question, what's the difference between 1.5 degree global average temperature increase, which is the goal of Paris, or the 2 degrees, which is in Paris as far below 2 degrees as possible, but let's try to hold it to 1.5 degrees. Global average temperature increase is a tough concept, especially when the numbers sound small. So, to say 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like much in a country like Canada, where we can swing from minus 30 in winter to plus 30 in summer. But global average temperature, any shift is a big number, right? So the difference in global average temperature between now and the last ice age for Canada is 5 degrees. That's so a degree is big. At 5 degrees is the difference between us now and being under 10 kilometers of ice. I mean, so these numbers that sound small are really large, and they don't turn on a dime. They don't go back. So what the global community asked the IPCC was, now that we've inked a deal that says that we will strive to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to what the global average temperature was before the Industrial Revolution, but we should also stay as far below 2 as possible. What's the difference in impacts? Like, what's going to be the difference in droughts and floods and in climate refugees? What's the difference between holding to 1.5 degrees and going to 2? God forbid, shooting past 2 to where we're on track now to 3 to 4. So what happens at 1.5 degrees Celsius and what happens at 2? And they found pretty scary stuff. You don't really want to go above 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC said clearly that we need urgent, immediate action. Now, they said that in October 2018. Yeah. And we have to get to 1.5, we must, all countries on Earth, collectively ensure that by 2030, the global emissions of carbon dioxide are down 45%. So when we have this kind of vague notion that it's leadership to say net zero by 2050, that's great if you're net zero by 2050. Has most of the heavy lifting done this decade. And that's what came through loud and clear in today's summit. Over and over again, world leaders said, this is the decade. We got to reduce our emissions this decade. I mean, Emmanuel Macron from France said 2030 is the new 2050. I mean, that's succinct.
Nice. You told me before the call you were live tweeting all through the day. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I figured, I mean, I am apparently a glutton for punishment, because I had to get up at 5 in the morning. Well, I had to be in front of my computer at 5 in the morning to hear what Biden said, because I was on pins and needles. What is the United States going to announce is their NDC? It was big and bold. It was 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, of course, it would have been better if it was a bigger number than 50, but 50 was what people like Bill McKibben and the US environmental movement, and they were saying, go to 50%. And here we are in Canada up until, I don't know if we've still yet filed a new NDC, but our new announced target from Trudeau was 40 to 45% below 2005. But I mean, we're dealing with, as I said, Boris Johnson was there from the UK, which has a fantastic climate record. And interestingly enough, and I think this is important, it has the commitments to climate action in the UK have survived shifts from Labour to Theresa May to Boris Johnson. They have a very strong Climate Accountability Act, which if Canada passes C12 as it is, we won't have a strong Climate Accountability Act. But the UK has a really good one. And it hasn't allowed, and I think also the culture of the EU and the UK has not allowed this business of right-wing or left-wing politics to own a climate issue. Right-wing politicians understand the science when you get to Europe, and they push hard. So it was an impressive day, and developing world had their voices, and an extremely powerful young Indigenous Fridays for the Future youth spoke, and she was phenomenal and said we have to stop the structures of colonialism, oppression, and capitalism. Now, I never thought we'd see a U.S. president open up the floor to a global audience for a young woman to call for the end of capitalism, but it was a good day. And as I said, Canada was about the weakest when we should have been one of the best.
Elizabeth, you spoke earlier about the Climate Act and Canada's C12. Can you unpack that for us a little bit, the difference between what's going on in the US and what we have tabled here?
Yeah. Well, right now, there are about a dozen countries around the world that have passed climate accountability acts. The UK was the first. They passed their act in 2008. One of the hallmarks of what they've done was to create a really respected, solid, scientifically grounded institute, which advises government on what's required on the science on action to avoid disastrous, catastrophic levels of climate emergency. And they're quite independent. They don't just report to the environment minister. They report to parliament, and they report once a year, and they hold the government to account. When they passed that law in 2008, because all of these laws have in common 5-year increments to assess how progress is going, the UK passed their law in 2008. Their first milestone year was 2013. They stick to 5-year increments. New Zealand just did the same thing, passed their climate accountability legislation. By the way, I'm very proud of my colleague who's the co-leader of the New Zealand Greens, who's the Minister of Climate in New Zealand. So James Shaw steered that through. But they made sure that when it passed, their first milestone year was 5 years in. Same thing for Denmark, something around the world. Costa Rica, there's strong reporting and a strong scientific base. So what's wrong with Canada's law? The only thing they took from other countries, they didn't apparently want to study lessons learned and what worked well in other places. They just took the name, Net Zero Climate Accountability, and they say our first milestone year is 2030. Well, if you take my point from the beginning of our conversation, that to save ourselves, to hang on to human civilization, because that's the stakes we're talking about, most of the heavy lifting has to be done before 2030. So they're going to report on how they're doing the first moment that the government's held to account for their targets. I mean, it's hardly accountability for the Liberals in 2021 to pass a law where someone will check on progress in 2030. It's really critical that we bake into the legislation, because they've made the legislation. And another thing is they don't have an independent, science-based, really strong institute. They have the usual kind of multi-stakeholder group to advise the minister. So there are a lot of fixes that we could do. As written, it's not helpful. It could be made helpful, but merely sort of strengthening it here or two with 1 or 2 amendments won't cut it. And I think Jonathan Wilkinson means well. I like him very much, but I know that he told the National Observer 2025 milestone year wasn't in the cards. Well, it better be, because if we're serious about achieving the reductions that they're going to table a new NDC, they should not say 40 to 45%. It's bad enough to start with a range. Say 45%. Then you at least begin to be in the ballpark of not irresponsible. The science for Canada would suggest that our minimum target should be 60% below 2005 by 2030. And I can get into the reasons why that is, but and also we need to do a heck of a lot of tree planting. We need to protect biodiversity, stop old growth logging. We need to cancel any new fossil fuel infrastructure, ban fracking. There's a long list of things that can be done quite readily if you're serious.
So I want to ask you a bit more about that, Elizabeth. Last week, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Mark Jacquard, and Mark's opinion was that we have one of the best climate governments in the world. and that
he endorsed the Liberals. I love Mark, but he did endorse the Liberals. Let's be clear. He's outed himself on this.
And that however, that they represent a big country that includes Alberta and the oil industry, and that they cannot walk away from the oil industry. And there's a lot of different ways you could put that, but you're there, you've been there for a long time now, watching it day in and day out. You were there under the Harper government, you're there now. What is your observation about what stops bigger climate action in Canada?
Well, let me just say, Mark's a friend and I love him and I endorsed his book, but he has been far too willing politically to think these are nice people, therefore we let them off the hook. I think when you have really nice people, as I said, tough love. It's not that I don't love them. It's just that my grandchildren's future is at stake. Do we have one of the best climate governments on earth? Oh, no, my goodness, no. It's to laugh to imagine that. Do we have people who mean well? Yes. But we must align our policies with the science, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it very clear that even if we do everything we can to hold to 1.5 degrees, it doesn't give us a guarantee that we hang on to human civilization. It gives our kids better odds. That's the science. And it's not about we could have bad weather. No. Well, that's all baked in. The atmosphere, we're at 417 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. There's never been a time that Homo sapiens walked upright, that we breathed atmosphere that had more than 280 parts per million. This is a huge leap from 280 to 415, 417. We're in this morning's summit, by the way. Actually, it was yesterday's. I was in a summit on a different age. A new coalition opened called 50 by 30, so 50% cuts globally by 2030. And the first person to address that summit was Cristiana Figueres, she's a Costa Rican diplomat who used to run the UN Secretariat on the Framework Convention on Climate Change. She said, we are approaching 3 major global tipping points. We can't afford to lose any of them. The 3 global tipping points she mentioned were the Western Antarctic ice sheet, the Arctic ice, and coral reefs. Those tip past the point that you can control them. And as she said, it's like dominoes. So we have slowing North Atlantic Ocean currents. That's a key global big worry. We have permafrost thaw. That's a big global worry. We're seeing ecosystem collapse, species extinction, large systems. Well, the collapse of the polar vortex, pushing colder, frigid weather down on Europe and Canada while it's warming and thawing in the Arctic. These are not small signs of trouble. These and the collapse of insect population. So I don't want to depress everybody. We can get out of this, but we can, as Greta Thunberg says, being happy, clappy about it. We can all be happy and have a wonderful economy and nothing has to change. We have to shut down the oil sands. Anyone who understands climate science will say, right, we can't be producing from the oil sands. We have to not build any new fossil fuel infrastructure, which means you have to cancel TMX. My fantasy phone call that would have been so great if when Justin Trudeau called Joe Biden as president for the first time, and Joe Biden says, Justin, we're canceling the Keystone Pipeline. Justin Trudeau should have said, way to go, Joe. I'll see you and raise you one. We're canceling TMX. That would have been a good start to a Canada-US relationship. We can't pretend that because, let me give you an example. Because we're a big country, we can't shut down something dangerous.
Yeah.
The Quebec government shut down the asbestos industry.
Mm.
It wasn't politically easy.
Mm-hmm.
Quebec shut down the asbestos industry after decades of Canada lying to the world and saying our asbestos was somehow safe for export, and the 100,000 a year, that was the conservative estimate, excess occupational deaths around the world from Canadian exports of asbestos was just we're nice people, so you have to forgive us for the fact that we have to export asbestos because Canada's complicated and no federal government wanted to offend the Quebec government until Pauline Marois came along and said, we're shutting down asbestos.
So that reminds me of, something Bill McKibben said, and he said it in his books. I can't remember whether he said it to me or he said it in his books, but he talks about the moment when he realized that he was going up against the most powerful industry in the world. And, what a really big thing that was. And so what you're talking about now is, in the difficulty of, closing down the oil sands, doing all these things that clearly need to happen to get there. What are you up against as you push this forward, and what are we up against as journalists? What are we up against as citizens?
Well, I mean, it's really tragic because when I started working on the climate issue, we didn't have an oil sands, right? I started working on climate. I got my climate science briefings when I worked in the office of the Minister of Environment in the 1980s. And I remember in detail, because I remember way too much stuff in detail, the 1993 Liberal Red Book. Jean Chrétien said we were going to have a target on climate action, and we were going to look at carbon taxing. And and at that point, what happened was that they won one seat in Alberta, and Anne McClellan won it by, I think it was 17 votes. Remember, they called her Landslide Annie. And Jean Chrétien suddenly dropped all of the climate commitments from the 1993 Red Book. And he went to Alberta and dumped several $billion to help the oil sands get started. They were producing about 500,000 barrels of oil a day then. The global price for a barrel of oil was about $30 a barrel. There was no private sector interest in investing in the oil sands because bitumen from the oil sands is extremely expensive to produce, and it's of inherently low value. It's a really bad product to rely on because it's a solid, and there's no big market around the world for get me your bitumen so I can then go through an expensive process to upgrade it, and then I can refine it. I mean, if it wasn't for government subsidies from the federal government and the lowest royalty rates on the planet from the government of Alberta, the oil sands were a creation of governments after we committed to reduce our emissions. So I can't feel that it's a bad thing to say from a policy point of view. We made a mistake there. We're going to have to shut down the oil sands by 2030. Now, that gives us lots of time to make sure that there's a just transition, because no one in Alberta should suffer. Maybe Jason Kenney, but the workers mustn't suffer. No community should feel that it's suffering. By the way, I was on a committee meeting, finance committee with Hassan Youssef yesterday, who is magnificent and the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. And he co-chaired a really good commission on what a just transition looks like. And he happened to mention to the committee when I asked him about it, that the commission, by the way, was exclusively on coal sector workers. He said one of the communities that the commission had visited, talking about we're shutting down the coal industry, we want to help this community and each individual worker get through this. He said one of the communities that he'd visited back then, this was probably only 4 years ago, had 200 jobs at risk. Since they adopted the strategies and the approach of just transition and moving into a clean economy, they have 2,000 new jobs. So we're given a lot of fear and loathing. We're given a lot of panic, job blackmail, but the economy and the quality of life and the well-being of the people of Alberta sure matters to me. And I don't like being put in the frame that because I want to shut down the TMX pipeline, I don't want any new fossil fuel, because the advice, it's pretty clear advice from the scientific community that we are at perilous risk of blowing past 1.5, blowing past 2, and hitting that tipping point where we have runaway global warming, and nothing we do as humanity will make a difference anymore because the emissions we've already launched into the atmosphere so overheat so many different systems that they're all thrown into a situation where, I mean, I don't know how many people on this call, there's so many now, there's over 300 people, but the concept of runaway global warming, we don't like to talk about, but what it means is that there are positive feedback loops. So when our forests burn, and boy, oh boy, are we seeing our forests burn. And you know, Linda, how much, even Vancouver, Victoria, we couldn't breathe for the smoke from California. Well, those forests going up in smoke are carbon dioxide and global warming gases going out in the atmosphere. So we dry out the forest from global warming. And then when the forest burns, it increases global warming. Same thing with permafrost thaw. As permafrost thaws, it releases methane, which speeds up warming, or the loss of Arctic ice, and we lose the albedo effect. So there's a point at which nothing we do will matter anymore. That's why there's still time. I really want to emphasize there is still time to avoid that, but not the way Justin Trudeau is handling this issue. And that is tragic because I think he really would, if he had his druthers, do way better.
Mm-hmm.
I wish he got good science advice, but Environment Canada is not the department it once was. Back, I mentioned I learned my climate science from the Environment Canada scientists in 1986 to 1988.
Mm-hmm.
There's no equivalent to that now in that department.
Wow. Well, thanks for that, Elizabeth. Before we go on, I'm going to be asking you next about the federal budget. But before we move to that, I want to take a moment to thank everybody for joining us today. As Elizabeth is expressing so amazingly eloquently, the climate crisis is really urgent. We're in an emergency. And the more of us who talk about it and the louder the conversation on climate gets, the more things have the possibility of moving. So when you support Canada's National Observer, you're actively funding meaningful climate change reporting. And it's really important. So please, if you haven't already, join our community. We have a special subscription offer exclusive to you for Earth Day, for those of you who are in attendance tonight. And okay, now for my next question, Elizabeth. The federal budget came out on Monday. It added another $17.6 billion in climate spending. Is that enough?
It's not about the spending. It's how can we have, I mean, I've gone through it very carefully. It's an interesting thing that there's a lot of money in this budget. It's actually money to the federal government, like money to Environment Canada to regulate something. So, okay, but it's not about the money. And there's some good money in here. But the point is, it doesn't add up to a plan, and it doesn't add up to sufficient emissions reductions to avoid going above 1.5 degrees. For Canada to pay our fair share of avoiding going above 1.5 degrees, we have to have a climate target of at least 60% below 2005 levels. Now, it's fine to say there's going to be all this climate spending here, but then we're building the Kinder Morgan TMX pipeline for $17 billion, coincidentally the same number, right? And public money. Well, so the cognitive dissonance piece is a problem. Some of what's in the section on the this is the printout of the climate budget section. I've gone through it, and I keep being surprised by things. But the money for carbon capture and storage is a lot of money for something that doesn't work. But it's one of those have your cake and eat it too solutions. So we can still be using coal, but if the coal plants are built such that they can, stick the carbon dioxide under the ground, shove it under the carpet, we won't see it anymore. It doesn't add up to what it would mean to say we're shutting down coal. We have to decarbonize our electricity sector. So what happens when, it was under Rachel Notley, they agreed they're going to shut down the coal plants in Alberta, but they decided to convert them to using natural gas in the same coal plants that are going to be inefficiently burning liquefied natural gas. So the CO2 is about the same. If you're fracking to get natural gas to go into an inefficiently burning converted coal plant, you've like the golden opportunity that's right in front of you. You're shutting down coal, great. You're decarbonizing, great. Don't put a different fossil fuel in the same place and say that that's progress. Alberta is, of all Canadian provinces, the best suited for solar energy. It's also extremely good for wind power and wind energy. And a friend of mine who actually works in the Alberta government pointed out there's 100,000 abandoned oil wells in Alberta, right? Approximately 10% of them have a sufficient heat at depth to generate geothermal energy. So Alberta could be a renewable energy superpower selling, I hate the word superpower, but that's what politicians usually say, but selling, too much politician speeches this morning at the Biden summit, but selling the green decarbonized electricity in a grid that connects all Canadians so no one part of this country ever has to use carbonized electricity sources at all, ever, by sharing and using the grid as something of a battery. It could all be done, but it's never going to be done if you're prepared to say, we've made a few good steps over here on climate, so we have to protect the fossil fuel guys over here because they'll get mad if we don't. Yeah. We just approved drilling for offshore oil and gas off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, why would we open up any new oil and gas developments? I mean, we have to leave it in the ground, and we have to do a carbon budget. That's what the EU does. We have to know what's our carbon budget, when do we blow past it? And there's a brilliant quote. I should probably pull it up, but it'll take me a while fiddling. I think it's page 273 of Mark Carney's new book, Values, in which he says, if we'd started in the year 2000 to reduce our emissions, we'd be, we could have cut them in half very easily. But he said, if we wait another 4 years, we're going to have to cut our emissions in half every single year. And if we wait 8 years, it's too late. That's the first milestone year of Bill C-12. So, I mean, I draw some comfort from the fact that there's pressure now from the Biden administration on Canada to do more. I draw some comfort from the fact that John Kerry is their number one, go around the world, twist arms and get people to do the right thing. But I also think it's not bad that Mark Carney is now back in Canada from being governor of the Bank of England. And when I read his book, I was enormously relieved that he doesn't just get climate a little bit, like, say, Bill Gates. He actually understands the science, and he can explain carbon budgets better than I can. And that encourages me.
Well, that's great. I heard you were reading that book, and I ordered it myself, and I'm just starting it. Love to get him on here and be able to talk to him. I just want to give some context, and then one more question before we go on to our subscriber questions. For some context about spending, the $17.6 billion that they allocated is in addition to the $15 billion outlined in December's climate plan. And
I don't think that's what I don't see in the budget.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
So I've got to figure that out. We've got the fall economic statement, and then we have some additional, and then some of the spending here needs to be analyzed against how much of it is really climate spending and how much of it is other stuff. So I mean, I'll say, Linda, I'm still digging in on that. Yeah. But we do have, of course, we have other subsidies besides the TMX pipeline. We're giving subsidies hands over fist to things like the LNG. Both the federal government and the BC government are subsidizing LNG. So if you're comparing the dollar signs, there's no overwhelming evidence that they're spending more on climate than they're spending on continuing to develop oil and gas.
Interesting. And I was going to go on to say the European Green Deal, and fact check me on this too, Elizabeth, has pledged 1 trillion euro, about 1.5 trillion Canadian over 10 years. The Biden administration announced a $2 billion plan to transition to green jobs over 4 years. Seth Klein's written, we'd need 20 to 40 billion a year to transition in Canada. So where does that leave us?
Well, the fact checking on the EU is right. It is they're committing much larger amounts of money. But again, a lot of this to me isn't just about where the money is a lot. And again, if you look at the bottom line on this, just in terms of fact checking, just to be clear, they do say in this budget that they're going to have it's over a period of 5 years. So it takes us to end of 2026. They're saying it will be 16 billion. But again, a lot of that money is investing in the government itself to develop things internally, to do research, to develop things that make me a little queasy, like what exactly is going to, there's money for nuclear in here. I don't count that as climate money because it's not a good allocation of resources. What we really need to do is as much energy efficiency as possible, as much building retrofitting as possible. There was definitely the announcements in December of 2020 were most, they're good things. I want to see them. They put some descriptions in the fall economic statement for energy retrofits for commercial buildings, this and for residential. This budget only does the residential piece. I've got a bit more number crunching to do, quite honestly, Linda.
I'd love you to, I'm going to ask you right here on the show, will you do a story for us? Will you do a column where you give us your climate budget?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And what I will do also is undertake to publish something that says, okay, now I've gone over the fall economic statement and I've gone over the budget. This is where but the problem here is,
like, what should it be? Like that's what we really need. I guess Seth has outlined that in his book, but I think for most of us, it's really hard to analyze these kinds of, spending programs when they come out.
Yeah, they don't have to all be spending programs. We could do a lot by regulation, you see, and this is where I get frustrated. Again, the notion that the federal government can't do much because so much is provincial jurisdiction. Right now we have a piece of legislation, it's just gotten some amendments to it, called the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, that right now would allow the Minister of Environment to do the kinds of things that we did to fight acid rain or get lead out of gasoline. We didn't spend tons of money to do those things because we regulated. It's okay. You're not allowed to do this anymore. So if you send, if a regulation is promulgated that says that every pulp and paper mill in Canada must cut their dioxins and furans by X amount, that's a regulation. It comes through the federal government. Pulp and paper mills are mostly provincial, sure, but the government regulates. And we seem to have forgotten that and thinks everything needs to be so complicated. Now, I wouldn't say for a minute that getting to 60% below 2005 levels by 2030 is easy. But on the Green Party website, you can still find it, which is it's called Mission Possible, where we actually crunch to say, okay, as you're shutting down these fossil fuel emitters, we're boosting up these renewables. A lot of this can be done through regulation as opposed to incentives and programs and tricky bits here and there. And spending has become a sort of a surrogate for action. It needs to be done, but your starting point is to cancel the subsidies.
So this time is going way too fast. You've said in the past that political will has been a problem, but we see public opinion put climate action as a top priority, and we see Canada's major trading partners put serious money into climate action plans. Even business executives are calling for more action. So is political will still the problem?
Yes. The IPCC report that I've referenced, the one from October 2018, said, listen, this is going to be tough. This is going to be very tough, but we don't lack for the technology to do this. This is to avoid going above 1.5. We can do it. We don't lack for the technology. We don't lack for any science. We don't lack for the alternatives. The only thing we're missing is political will. Now, I go back to when I was negotiating. What an honor it was to be part of that work back in 1987 to negotiate the Montreal Protocol that actually worked and saved the ozone layer. And the missing ingredient between our action on ozone and our action on climate is that the ozone protocol signed in Montreal in 1987 included enforcement mechanisms that were meaningful. So back in 1987, when we negotiated the Montreal Protocol, it said if any country that's a party to this treaty, since the whole world was in the treaty, any country that's a party to this treaty violates the treaty and manufactures chlorofluorocarbons, every other country that's part of this treaty can exercise trade sanctions against the offending party. That's a very effective enforcement mechanism. Before we got to Kyoto, which was only 10 years later, 1997, the ability to include trade sanctions as an enforcement mechanism had been taken away from environmental treaties by the creation of the World Trade Organization. Now, this is, they didn't make any rulings as a World Trade Organization. They just said, the trade ministers at every cabinet table who are senior turned to the junior guys, the environment ministers, and said, no more of that. We don't want to have environmental treaties that get in the way of trade. So we really need to revise our global agreements such that a country that ignores its targets, as Canada has done, is punished. Because that's an incentive. So political will, where do you get political will? Oh, we don't want that to happen. So it's a very important, and it's also important to say some of these decisions are tough. If I can tell one quick anecdote, Linda, about the acid rain days, when I was working, I was an advisor in the Mulroney government. I hasten to add, I was never a member of that party, but boy, we did good work. And this is a story really about the Ontario government of those days, which was Liberal, which was David Peterson Premier and a guy named Jim Bradley, Environment Minister. Just to say that Inco, the largest point source of sulfur dioxide that caused acid rain in North America, our largest point source polluter was in Ontario, Inco. And Inco tried job blackmail. It threatened Jim Bradley, and then their CEOs went to David Peterson because Jim Bradley said, I think you can do it. We know we're sticking to this. They went to the premier and said, fire your environment minister. He's going to lose you all these jobs at Inco. This is political will. David Peterson looked at the CEO of Inco and said, I have a lot of confidence in you guys to figure this out. we're going to regulate that you have to cut CO2, SO2 in half, sulfur dioxide. And so they did. So that's the difference in political will. We have a lot of politicians now, and basically across parties, that never saw that happening, and they're not quite so sure, can we do that? Now, I would have thought they would have learned they could do it because of COVID. They acted fast. They told people, in different businesses, you have to shut down. You can't fly today. But for some reason on climate, they feel as though everything's more important than actually making a tough decision.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that. We're now at the part of our hour where we're going to turn to our questions from our subscribers. They've recorded them for us, and let's jump right in. The first one is from Ronan Roy in Toronto. And okay.
Hi, Elizabeth. My name is Ronan Roy. I am 20 years old, and I'm about to be a student at Sheridan College for Animal Care. What would you do in order to solve the main issue of mass fishing industries that are potentially harming populations of fish, sea mammals, and marine ecosystems, such as coral reefs?
Thanks, Ronan. And it's a great question. It brings to mind that I should have mentioned by now, Linda, that we also have the targets to 2030 that are found in the Sustainable Development Goals. And the SDG goals are totally important. They include, of course, there's 17 different SDG goals, and one of them is living oceans. There's a lot of good solutions in there. We need to deal with the basically illegal fishing operations, basically pirate operations that happen all around the world outside of people's 200-mile limits. We have to crack down on those. We have to have an effective enforcement on overfishing. We have to get the plastics out of the ocean. And also, again, to mention that one of the biggest threats to the life in our oceans is ocean acidification from the direct chemical action of as there's more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere because of our fossil fuel burning, it mixes with sea water and it creates carbonic acid, which can melt seashells, which is, by the way, already making it impossible on Vancouver Island for people that raise oysters to seed them and grow them off our coast. They have to, colder water acidifies faster than warmer water. So they take these oysters to Hawaii to get them big enough that their shells won't melt when they bring them back here. So overfishing in our oceans is a critical issue. And thank you, Ronan, for raising it.
Our next question is from Lori Waters.
Dear Elizabeth, happy anniversary, happy Earth Day. Please tell me, what can Canadians do to ensure that we get the federal government to end fossil fuel subsidies? Thanks. Hugs.
So as you can tell, I know Lori, she's a constituent, and it is my wedding anniversary tonight. That's that. John and I got married on Earth Day 2 years ago.
Oh my God, happy anniversary.
Yeah. So Lori, this is one of those things that makes me go round the bend. The Harper administration committed to getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies in 2009 at a G20 summit. Trudeau ran on getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies in 2015 and again in 2019. And when asked in Parliament the other day, what do you make of the fact that Joe Biden just signed an executive order to end fossil fuel subsidies? Justin Trudeau said, I'm really pleased to see him following our lead. So we have to demand it. It is so unhelpful, to put it mildly, to be subsidizing something we want to stop. And so I think political pressure, I think saying to the Prime Minister, we're going to be, the next fixed election date for Canada is 2023. But everybody talks about it as though it's a foregone conclusion that Justin Trudeau will try to do the same thing that Blaine Higgs did in New Brunswick and John Horgan did in British Columbia, put us in an election as soon as possible and get to a majority government. Make it a campaign issue. Hound people in the election campaign and hound Justin Trudeau. I mean, I really, as I said, it is tough love. I think of him as a friend, and I know his kids and I know his mom, and I'm not a mean person, but I want to shake him. I just say, you've got to do, you have it in you to do better. You have it in you to be a better climate leader. You have it in you to say, we're canceling the fossil fuel subsidies. This makes no sense at all. So that's so again, great question, Lori. What will it take? I think it will take a lot more people than me telling Justin Trudeau he's got to do it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, so our next question comes from Angelica Hackett.
Hello, Ms. May. I'm Angelica Hackett. I'm a member of Canada's Green Party, and my husband is in the NDP. Isn't it time for both parties to get together to improve the chances for climate action and progressive government in Canada? Thank you.
Well, the first past the post voting system does create really difficulties for voters. And there's no question but that for a lot of people, especially when Harper was prime minister, and I tried in a number of ways to promote cooperation. And I tried to reach Jack Layton at the time, God rest his soul, to talk about cooperation. I can assure you from many scars and many injuries, the NDP is not interested in cooperating with us. I'm always open to it. As you'll know from Burnaby, we didn't run anyone against Jagmeet in his by-election. They're just not open to it. And frankly, I don't see climate leadership there either. So vote Green.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, we have two more really great questions, so I want to be sure we get to both of them. So the first one is from Tom Graff in Vancouver.
Is the Canadian government able to do anything if the provinces object?
Thank you, Tom. An excellent question. And the answer is yes. The Canadian government can and has in the past. It's important not to do things in ways that create constitutional crises. We had a debate late last night. I was saying to Linda, we forced an emergency debate on the COVID crisis and the variants. And we ended up saying, we really shouldn't be so afraid of offending a premier that people have to die. There are ways. Number one, the federal government has way more power. As I mentioned earlier, they can regulate, they can use the budget power, they can stop subsidizing fossil fuels. And really the way to talk to provinces is one at a time. That's how we did the acid rain agreements. We negotiated with the federal government and each province separately till all of them had, well, the ones that were polluting, the 7 eastern provinces, all of them agreed to cut their emissions in half. If you'd pulled them all in a room together at the same time, you'd have been driven by the lowest common denominator decision-making. So we are a federation that poses difficulties, but I've seen us work much better in the past. We just need to do it now because as it's I think, screamingly clear, we're running out of time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, and so our last questions come from two sisters in Toronto, Navia and Radhika.
Hi, Elizabeth. My name's Navia. What are you going to do to help the animals? My name is Radhika Jen, and I'm in grade 1. I know a few things about pollution, like car pollution, where like gas would be coming out the back of your car. And what can kids do to stop pollution?
Well, I don't know where you found Navia and Radhika, but thank you. I hope you're watching tonight, and I want to thank you so much for asking those good questions. What we can do for the animals is we can love them. And if you love your animals, you're not cruel to them. We need new laws in Canada to protect animals from cruelty. We need to think about making sure that, and I'm very proud of the fact I got through a bill in Parliament to ban the keeping of whales and dolphins in captivity. Taking care of our animals is really important. When I was, I think, a little older than Navia and Radhika, when I was 10, I decided to stop eating meat. And it wasn't, it was because I love my animals. So there, you can think about things you want to do. And Radhika, what you can do to stop pollution, particularly car pollution, I think you probably come from a very cool parents, and your parents don't put you in the car all the time to go to the store. But if people are saying, let's take the car to go to the store, kids can say, let's walk. Kids can say, can I take my bike? Kids can say, let's get on the bus. And that's, I was very lucky as I was raising my daughter, who's now almost 30, in that I didn't own a car between 1980 and 2006. And it would be so much fun when we'd pick up her friends from school and get on the bus to go home. And one of her friends' father was at that time the Minister of Environment. And as we got on the bus, she said, what's this? So, kids can tell their parents, and it will educate their parents.
Wow. Okay, Elizabeth, everyone, thank you so much. What a great conversation. I'm so sorry it has gone by so fast. I want to thank everyone who submitted their video questions. I want to say if you'd like to send us a video question for future guests, all you have to do is subscribe. We have a few more conversations left before we're going to take a break over the
Can
summer.
I say something really quickly? I saw somebody put in the chat, and it's so important. Thank Ravia and Radhika's teachers in this COVID pandemic. My heart goes out to all our teachers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Everyone be safe, and all the frontline workers. But Navia and Radhika, you made my day. Thank you for joining us. And I never said I'm on the traditional territory of the Wasonic Nation. Haishkasiyam.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And, we're still going to hear from Yolanda. Don't go away. I just wanted to say, though, we have some really cool people joining us next. The young leaders of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative will be with us on May 13th. Seth Klein is joining us on May 20th to discuss his latest book. And in June, author Alexandra Samuels is going to be speaking about working from home and the impact on our carbon footprint. Tonight's episode with Elizabeth was produced by Shadayer Tashvidi at the Canadian Centre for Journalism. While Yolanda's getting ready to start playing, I just wanted to invite you to check out our new website, canadianjournalism.ca, and give a big shout out to my colleagues, Janelle Johnson, Jenny Uechi, Yamina Salamlal, and Polly Leisure, to our subscribers, most of all, and our readers, to all the reporters and editors at Canada's National Observer. And now I'm going to give you back to Yolanda before we say good evening.
Thank you so much, Linda and Elizabeth, for that energizing conversation. And I've chosen a piece of music that is a little bit musically complex, perhaps as complex as the climate crisis. So I hope you enjoy it. It's written by an Argentinian composer. His name is Astor Piazzolla, and he uses tango and classical and jazz influences. It's quite a fun piece. I hope you like it.